The sewage-stained streets of Port Valon's industrial district reeked of diesel fumes and rotting fish. Steam hissed from ancient pipes that snaked between crumbling tenements, while the constant clang of machinery echoed off brick walls stained black with decades of soot. In this maze of forgotten alleys, where even the city's sanitation crews refused to venture, a figure moved like a shadow between the garbage bins. Zephyr pressed her back against the cold stone wall, her translucent, blue skin almost glowing in the dim light that filtered through the perpetual smog. Her elongated limbs trembled from hunger, and the chitinous plates along her forearms had dulled to a sickly gray from malnutrition. The gossamer wings that marked her species had been torn and battered, one hanging at an unnatural angle from a beating she'd received 3 days prior. A group of human workers emerged from the textile factory across the street, their voices carrying across the narrow alley. Zephyr instinctively curled smaller, wrapping her arms around her knees. She had learned to make herself invisible in this city that saw her kind as nothing more than pests. "Look what crawled out of the gutter," one of the workers called out. Pointing directly at her hiding spot, his companions turned, their faces twisting into cruel grins. "Hey, bug girl, you hungry?" They laughed, as one of them kicked an empty can in her direction. It clattered against the wall beside her head, but Zephyr didn't flinch. Movement only encouraged them. She had learned this lesson through countless encounters with the humans who seemed to take pleasure in her suffering. "Dance for us, and maybe we'll throw you some real food," another worker jeered, pulling a half-eaten sandwich from his lunch pail and waving it tauntingly. Zephyr's stomach clenched painfully at the sight of food. But she remained still. Her large, multifaceted eyes reflected the dim light as she watched them, calculating whether she could reach the drainage pipe at the end of the alley before they could catch her. "What's wrong? Can't understand human speech?" The first worker took a step closer. "Maybe we need to teach you some manners." The group began to advance, their laughter taking on a darker tone. Zephyr's muscles tensed, ready to bolt, when the factory whistle shrieked across the district. The workers stopped, cursing under their breath as they realized their break was over. With final mocking gestures in her direction, they trudged back toward the building. Alone again, Zephyr allowed herself to breathe. She uncurled slowly, her joints protesting after hours of remaining motionless. The torn wings sent sharp spikes of pain down her spine as she moved, but she ignored it. Pain was constant now, just another element of her existence, like the hunger that gnawed at her insides, or the cold that seeped into her bones each night. She resumed her search through the refuse, her delicate fingers sifting through soggy cardboard and discarded packaging. Sometimes the factory workers dropped pieces of their meals, and if she was quick enough, she could salvage them before the rats claimed them. Today luck favored her. A crust of bread, only slightly moldy, lay hidden beneath a torn newspaper. As she ate the meager find, Zephyr allowed her mind to drift back to before the accident at the spaceport that had stranded her here. Before her identification papers had been destroyed in the fire. Before she had become invisible to every government agency she'd approached for help. Dismissed as another illegal immigrant trying to game the system. She had been someone once. A student, an engineer, a person with dreams and a future. Now she was simply surviving, one day bleeding into the next, measuring her life in scraps of food and safe places to sleep. The city had forgotten her completely, and she was beginning to forget herself. Marcus Thorne adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses as he climbed the rusted fire escape leading to the cargo oversight office. His weathered hands gripped a leather satchel containing weeks of meticulous documentation shipping. Manifests that didn't add up. Delivery schedules that had been altered. Invoices for food shipments that somehow never reached the distribution centers in the lower districts. At 52, Marcus had spent the better part of his life buried in paperwork, tracking the flow of goods through Port Valon's massive shipping network. What had started as a mundane job had gradually revealed itself to be something far more sinister. Someone was systematically diverting food supplies meant for the city's poorest residents. And Marcus had spent months building an ironclad case. He paused on the landing, looking down at the industrial maze below. The afternoon shift was changing, and workers streamed through the narrow streets like ants. That's when he saw Hertha, alien girl pressed against the wall, so still she might have been a statue. He watched as the group of men spotted her, their casual cruelty unfolding with predictable brutality. Marcus felt his jaw tighten. He had seen this scene play out countless times, the systematic dehumanization of anyone different, anyone vulnerable. But this time, something clicked into place in his mind. The missing food shipments, the falsified records, the deliberate starvation of entire neighborhoods, it all connected to moments like this. To people like her, who had been rendered invisible by a system designed to ignore their suffering. As the workers dispersed and the girl resumed her desperate search for scraps, Marcus made a decision that would change both their lives. He descended the fire escape and walked directly toward the alley where she huddled. Zephyr tensed as footsteps approached, expecting another round of harassment. Instead, she found herself looking up at a middle-aged human with kind eyes and calloused hands. He wore a simple gray sweater and carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who had worked hard for everything he owned. "Excuse me," Marcus said softly, crouching down to her level so he wouldn't loom over her. "I saw what happened. Are you hurt?" Zephyr stared at him suspiciously. In her experience, human kindness always came with a price. She shook her head minutely, not trusting her voice. Marcus studied her carefully, taking in the obvious signs of prolonged malnutrition and the poorly healed injuries that marked her delicate frame. "When did you last eat a real meal?" The question hung in the air between them. Zephyr's throat worked silently as she tried to remember. Days, weeks, time had become fluid in her struggle for survival. "There's a small cafe 3 blocks from here," Marcus continued, his voice gentle but firm. "The owner is a friend of mine. She serves actual food, not scraps from a gutter. Will you let me take you there?" Zephyr's multifaceted eyes searched his face for signs of deception. She had learned to read human expressions with the skill of someone whose life depended on it. But Marcus's offer seemed genuine, motivated by something she had almost forgotten existed, simple human compassion. "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the distant rumble of machinery. Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering. His answer, "Because no one should have to live like this. Because I've spent months documenting how food meant for people like you disappears into the pockets of corrupt officials. Because someone needs to break the cycle." He stood slowly, extending his hand, but not forcing her to take it.
Ow.
"I can't solve everything that's wrong with this city, but I can make sure you have a warm meal today." Zephyr looked at his outstretched hand, then at the alley that had been her world for so long. The choice seemed impossibly large. Trust this stranger or continue scraping by in the shadows. But her body made the decision for her. The gnawing hunger, the bone-deep exhaustion, desperate need for just one moment of human kindness. It's all crystallized into a single word. "Zephyr," she said, placing her trembling hand in his. Vera Blackwood had seen every type of person walk through the doors of her small cafe over the past 30 years. Dock workers seeking refuge from brutal shifts, office clerks grabbing quick lunches, and occasionally people who simply needed a place to exist without judgment. But when Marcus Thorne entered with the alien girl at his side, Vera knew immediately that this was different. The cafe itself was unremarkable. Tables crammed into a space barely large enough for 8. Walls yellowed by decades of cooking smoke, and a coffee machine that wheezed like an old man climbing stairs. But it was clean, warm, and filled with the honest smell of food cooked with care rather than profit in mind. Zephyr hesitated at the threshold, her large eyes scanning the room for threats. The other patrons, a handful of late afternoon diners, glanced up with varying degrees of curiosity and indifference. One man openly stared, his expression hostile, but Vera's sharp look sent him back to his soup with a grunt. "Marcus," Vera called from behind the counter, her voice carrying the no-nonsense tone of someone who had raised 4 children and buried 2 husbands. "Your usual table?" She was a sturdy woman in her mid-60s, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a practical bun and hands that bore the permanent stains of decades spent cooking. Her brown eyes missed nothing as she took in Zephyr's condition, the torn clothing, the obvious malnutrition, the way she held herself like someone expecting a blow. Marcus guided Zephyr to a corner table, positioning himself so he sat between. Her and the rest of the room. "Vera, this is Zephyr. She's hungry." Those 3 words carried more weight than a lengthy explanation. Vera had learned long ago that some situations required action rather than questions. She disappeared into the kitchen and returned moments later with a bowl of thick vegetable soup, a plate piled high with bread, and a glass of clean water. "Eat slowly," Vera advised gently, setting the food in front of Zephyr. "Your stomach needs time to remember what real food feels like." Zephyr stared at the meal as if it might vanish. If she blinked, steam rose from the soup, carrying scents that made her mouth water and her hand shake. She looked between Marcus and Vera, still searching for the catch, the demand that would come with this kindness. "Payment required," Vera said, reading, her expression with practiced ease. "Sometimes people just need food. Sometimes we just need to feed them. That's how it works." As Zephyr tentatively began to eat, Marcus leaned forward and spoke quietly to Vera. "She's been living on the streets. No papers, no support, no recognition that she even exists according to the city." Vera nodded grimly. She had seen it before, the systematic erasure of inconvenient people. The way bureaucracy could make someone disappear more effectively than any weapon. "The room's upstairs," she said after a moment. "The small one in the back has been empty. For weeks. She could stay there while she gets back on her feet." "Vera, I can't ask you to." "You're not asking. I'm offering." Recurred. No argument. "Marcus, you've been coming here for 8 years. You've never asked for anything. Always paid your bills. Always treated my staff with respect. You say she needs help? Then she gets help." Zephyr had been listening to their quiet conversation while methodically working through the soup. Spoonfuls seemed to awaken something in her that had been dormant for months, not just her appetite, but her hope. When Vera mentioned the room, she finally spoke. "I don't have money for rent," she said, her voice stronger now that she had some food in her system. Vera waved dismissively. "Money's just one way to pay for things. There are others." Yeah. "You look like someone who knows how to work." "The cafe needs help cleaning, prep work, simple tasks. You do that, you earn your keep. Fair trade." The concept of fair trade was so foreign to Zephyr's recent experience that she almost couldn't process it. For months, every interaction had been about taking advantage, about extracting what little she had left. But these 2 humans, this odd pair of a bureaucrat and a cafe owner, were offering something different. "Why?" she asked again, the question that had become her constant refrain. Vera sat down across from her, her weathered hands folded on the scarred wooden table. "Honey, 30 years ago I was sleeping in my car with 2 babies because my first husband drank away our rent money. Stranger gave me a job washing dishes and a place to stay. I've been paying that forward ever since." She paused, studying Zephyr's face. "The world's got enough cruelty in it. Sometimes you have to make room for kindness, even if it's just a small corner of it." As the afternoon light faded outside the cafe windows, 3 strangers found themselves bound together by the simple recognition that everyone deserved dignity, safety, and enough food to survive. It was a small beginning, but like all meaningful changes, it started with someone choosing to see the humanity in another person. Inspector Dante Crow sat in his climate-controlled office overlooking Port Valon's main shipping district, reviewing the quarterly reports that kept his carefully constructed empire running smoothly. For 5 years, he had orchestrated the systematic diversion of food shipments, skimming enough to make himself wealthy while leaving just enough to avoid suspicion. It was a delicate balance, and until now, it had made him untouchable. Crow was a man who understood power, how to acquire it, how to wield it, and how to eliminate threats to it. His connections reached into every level of the Port Authority, the City Council, and the shipping companies. He had built his fortune on the simple principle that the desperate were invisible, and the invisible could be safely ignored. The knock on his door interrupted his calculations. His secretary entered with a manila envelope marked "Urgent Review." "This came from the Cargo Oversight Department," she said, her voice tight with nervousness. "The routing says it requires immediate attention." Crow tore open the envelope and found himself staring at months of meticulous documentation. Shipping manifests with discrepancies highlighted in red ink, delivery schedules that had been altered, invoices that didn't match actual distributions. Every piece of his operation laid bare with mathematical precision. At the bottom of the stack was a cover letter signed by Marcus Thorne, requesting a formal investigation into systematic food theft affecting the lower districts. Copied to the mayor's office, the Port Authority Board, and 3 different news outlets. Crow's face darkened as he reached for his phone. Within minutes, he had Marcus's employment record, home address, and daily routine pulled up on his computer. The bureaucrat had made a fatal mistake. He had forgotten that challenging the system meant challenging the people who controlled it. Meanwhile, 3 blocks away in Vera's cafe, Marcus was helping Zephyr learn the rhythm of the evening shift. She had spent the day in the small upstairs room, sleeping deeply for the first time in months, and had emerged looking more alert and focused than she had since arriving in the city. "The dinner rush starts in about an hour," Marcus explained. Showing her how to set tables and organize the cutlery, Vera usually handles the cooking while her evening staff manages the front of house. Zephyr moved with surprising grace despite her injured wing, her natural dexterity making quick work of the simple tasks. For the first time in months, she felt useful rather than desperate. The work gave her hands something to do besides scavenge, and the routine provided structure to days that had become an endless blur of survival. "Marcus," Vera called from the kitchen. "There's someone here to see you." The man waiting by the front door wore an expensive suit and the practiced smile of someone accustomed to getting his way. He introduced himself as Detective Raymond Hull. Claiming to represent the Port Authority's Internal Affairs Division, "Mr. Thorne," Hull said, his voice carrying an undertone of threat disguised as politeness, "I understand you've made some serious allegations about shipping irregularities. My employer would like to discuss these concerns with you privately." Marcus felt his stomach drop. He had known this moment Woodcombe had prepared for it but the reality was more intimidating than he had anticipated. "Any discussion can happen through proper channels," he replied, his voice steadier than he felt. Hull's smile never wavered. "I think you misunderstand the situation. These aren't allegations that can be handled through normal bureaucratic processes. They require immediate attention from people with the authority to make problems disappear permanently." The threat was clear enough that even Zephyr, standing behind the counter, understood its implications. Her large eyes fixed on the detective with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. She had learned to recognize predators, and everything about this man screamed danger. "Mr. Thorne has filed official reports through proper channels," Vera interjected. Moving to stand beside Marcus, "If your people have concerns, they can address them through those same channels." Hull's attention shifted to the cafe owner and his expression hardened. "This establishment operates under city permits that require renewal every year. It would be unfortunate if those permits encountered bureaucratic difficulties." The casual way he threatened Vera's livelihood made Marcus's decision for him. He had suspected that exposing the corruption would bring retaliation, but seeing it extend to innocent people who had simply helped him crystallized his resolve. "Tell your employer," Marcus said quietly, "that the documentation has already been distributed to multiple parties. Silencing me won't make the evidence disappear." Hull studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "We'll see about that." Turned and left, but the threat lingered in the air like smoke. As the door closed behind the detective, Zephyr approached Marcus. "You're in danger because of the food theft reports?" Marcus nodded grimly. "People like Inspector Crow don't stay in power by allowing challenges to their authority. But sometimes doing the right thing means accepting the consequences." For Zephyr, who had spent months learning that the system was designed to crush people like her, seeing someone willingly stand against that system was both inspiring and terrifying. She realized that Marcus hadn't just given her food and shelter, he had shown her that it was possible to fight back against injustice, even when the cost was enormous. That evening, as they worked side by side preparing for the dinner service, all 3 of them understood that their small act of kindness had drawn them into something much larger and more dangerous than they had anticipated. 6 months later, the lower districts of Port Vallon looked different. Not transformed change in a place like this came slowly and unevenly, but different enough that people noticed. Food distribution centers that had been perpetually empty, now maintained regular supplies. Systematic harassment of non-human residents had decreased, not eliminated, but reduced enough to matter. Zephyr stood behind the counter of what was now officially called Vera's place. Watching the morning rush of customers filter through, her torn wing had healed enough to fold properly against her back, and regular meals had restored the natural luminescence to her blue skin. More importantly, she moved through the world with confidence rather than fear. The investigation sparked by Marcus's reports had taken months to complete, but the results had been decisive. Inspector Crow and 7 other officials were facing federal charges for embezzlement and conspiracy. The stolen food had been valued at over 2 million credits, but its true cost was measured in the lives of people who had gone hungry while their supplies were diverted to black market sales. Marcus had testified before 3 different committees, his meticulous documentation forming the backbone of the prosecution's case. The retaliation he had feared materialized in the form of death threats, harassment, and attempts to discredit his work, but the evidence was too comprehensive to dismiss. "Order up," Vera called from the kitchen, sliding a plate across the service window. The cafe had expanded into the adjoining storefront, doubling its capacity and creating jobs for a dozen local residents. Zephyr had evolved from helper to assistant manager, her natural intelligence and work ethic making her indispensable to the operation. More importantly, she had become visible not as a refugee or charity case, but as a valued member of the community. The changes weren't limited to the cafe. Marcus's investigation had inspired other bureaucrats to examine their own departments for irregularities. A network of corruption that had seemed untouchable began to unravel as people found the courage to speak up. The local news outlets, initially skeptical of allegations against such well-connected officials, became aggressive in their reporting as the scope of the scandal became clear. "Zephyr," a voice called from the entrance. She looked up to see Tam Rivera, a young human woman who had been sleeping in doorways when Zephyr first suggested she might find work at the cafe. Now Tam was enrolled in night classes while working. Days as a server, her life stabilized by the same combination of opportunity and support that had saved Zephyr. "The housing committee approved my application," Tam announced, grinning widely. "I get the apartment next week." It was a small victory, but small victories had a way of accumulating into something larger. The cafe had become an unofficial headquarters for people trying to rebuild their lives, a place where someone could get help without judgment or bureaucratic obstacles. Marcus entered during the lunch rush, carrying a folder of documents that had become his trademark. But his expression was lighter than it had been in months. The federal prosecutor called, he announced to Vera and Zephyr. Crow pled guilty. This morning, full restitution plus prison time. The other defendants are expected to follow suit. Vera nodded approvingly as she flipped pancakes on the griddle. About time. "What happens to all that stolen food money?" "The settlement fund will be used to improve food distribution in the affected districts," Marcus replied. "Plus, expanded support services for undocumented residents." Zephyr felt something shift in her chest, not quite closure, but a sense that the suffering she had endured had served a purpose beyond mere survival. Her time in the alleys, the casual cruelty she had faced, the systematic dehumanization, all of it had led to this moment where real change became possible. That evening, after the last customer had left and the dishes were cleaned, the 3 of them sat around the corner table, where Zephyr had eaten her first real meal in months. The cafe was quiet except for the distant sounds of the city settling into night. "What happens now?" Zephyr asked, the question that had defined so much of her journey. Marcus leaned back in his chair, looking tired but satisfied. "Working. The corruption investigation opened doors, but someone has to walk through them. There are other neighborhoods, other people who need help." Vera poured 3 cups of coffee, the ritual that had marked the end of countless difficult days. "The work's never finished," she said pragmatically. "But that doesn't mean it's not worth doing." Zephyr sipped her coffee and looked around the cafe that had become her home. 6 months ago, she had been invisible, discarded by a system that refused to acknowledge her existence. Tonight, she was surrounded by friends, engaged in meaningful work, and planning for a future that seemed not just possible, but bright. The transformation hadn't been magical or sudden. It had been built through small acts of courage. Choosing to file his report, Vera offering a room, Zephyr deciding to trust strangers who showed her kindness. Each decision had created space for the next, building momentum until change became inevitable. Outside, Port Vallon continued its endless cycle of ships and cargo, workers and commerce. But in the small corners, where people had chosen compassion, over indifference, the city was becoming something better than it had been. Not perfect, not paradise, but a place where someone like Zephyr could build a life worth living. As the three friends planned their next day's work, their conversation carried the quiet satisfaction of people who had learned that the world could be changed. One person at a time, one choice at a time, one act of courage at a time.